Welcome to Decoding Superhuman. This show is a deep dive into obsessions with performance and how to improve the human experience. Twice a week, I explore the latest science, technology, and tactics with experts in various fields of human optimization. I'm your host, Boomer Anderson. Enjoy the journey. Smart conversations with smart people. This is the enjoyment that I get out of this podcast. I love dissecting different domains of performance and giving you guys bite-sized pieces of actionable information to help you optimize your performance. And today we get to dissect many different domains with one of the smartest people in the world. I have to give a shout out to Dr. Scott Scher for providing the introduction here. My guest today is Dr. Ted Achacoso. Dr. Achacoso earned his college degree in biology at the age of 18, and he earned his Doctor of Medicine degree at the age of 22. This bio continues to be more and more impressive as we go, and I promise I'm not going to read the whole thing because that would take up the entire time of the podcast. At 25, he was a fellow of Interventional Neuroradiology, a research professor of pharmacology and toxicology, and a clinical professor of neurology in Manila. At 28, he became a professor of medical informatics and of interventional neuroradiology in Washington, D.C., where he also performed artificial intelligence research biased towards connectionist systems. At 40, he traded currencies using artificial intelligence predictive techniques for a private fund. And at 45, he retrained in interventional endocrinology, aka anti-aging medicine, and in nutritional medicine in Paris, becoming double board certified in both specialties. Dr. Ted has been published in numerous peer-reviewed scientific journals, holds U.S. patents, as well as software algorithms, provides TV and podcast interviews, and delivers lectures all around the world. He currently has a tri-continental practice in health optimization medicine, which we get into quite a bit on this podcast, which is a clinical framework that he pioneered to include health management in a disease management practice. Dr. Ted also formulated the Blue Cannatine nootropic troche, a product of the Troscriptions line of Smarter, Not Harder Inc. And that last part is something that I'm so excited is coming to the market very soon. Dr. Ted is extremely generous with his time. Case in point, he blocked out his entire afternoon to speak with me. As a result, we talked for well over 2 hours, so I decided to break out our conversation into 2 separate podcast episodes. The second episode will come out next week, but today we get into jet lag, specifically what Dr. Ted uses on himself to optimize his jet lag running a tri-continental, that is the United States, Europe, as well as in the Philippines, practice. We talk about dynamic systems, consciousness, the mathematics of consciousness, chaos theory, and so much more. The show notes for this one are at decodingsuperhuman.com/home. Enjoy my episode with Dr. Ted Achacoso. Dr. Ted Achacoso, there are so many things I want to talk to you about today, so thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So
way around the world.
You are way across the world, that's for sure. And before we get into some of that way across the world life that you live, there's a broad number of topics that I want to cover here today. And so for everybody listening, I'm just going to rattle off a few of those. We may not even get to all of them. We may go down a few wormholes here. But I want to, of course, talk to you, Dr. Ted, about your background, things like dynamic systems and networks, health optimization medicine, peptides, nootropics, psychedelics, and so much more. So shall we get started?
Yes. Fire away.
All right. So the first thing that I want people to realize is that you emailed me saying that you had come from DC to Zurich, and now you're in Manila.
Yes.
That brings about a logical question, which a lot of the audience has to deal with, which is how do you compensate or deal with jet lag?
Well, how for me the problem more is how do you compensate or deal with long-term jet lag, right? I've
Yeah.
been doing this for the past 10 years, I work 30 days of the quarter here in Asia, and I spend quite a bit of my time in Europe as well. When you're young and your body is young, you could actually do it by brute force. But when you're older, like I am, you have to manage a few basic things. First is, the lifestyle that you have when you are traveling. As soon as I get in a plane, I already assume the time zone of the place that I'm going to. I already assume the times for eating that I do. One of the big secrets that I have for life and for jet lag as well is having a restricted feeding window, right? So, or I call it a shortened feeding window. So I only eat in about a window of about 8 hours a day. So when I'm in Washington, D.C., I eat from 12 noon to 8 p.m., and then adjust that window accordingly wherever I am. So here in Manila, it's a 12-hour time difference, and we're ahead. And I do, I eat my breakfast at around 7:30 and I stop eating at 3:30 in the afternoon. So the last thing that turns over is your gut. So you actually have to take care of your gut. The other thing that's expected of you, of course, if you're running a company or if you're running a country, just like some of my clients are, is that you're expected to perform right when you land, right? And that's where you actually have to put in your the way I deal with this is having the major hormones actually optimized in my body. So, for example, right now I just shifted my cycle to Manila, right? So all my daytime hormones like my thyroid, my cortisol, etc., are not being produced within the first few days that I have arrived here. So even growth hormone, for example, which goes in 4 pulses in men, will not be produced during the daytime here. But the problem is either you have to deliver a lecture, a speech, or see patients, and so forth. So what you do is you actually make those hormones as they should be coming on in your body. So in the morning, so when you expose yourself to sunlight, your skin is exposed to sunlight, your cortisol level rises, it wakes you up, your thyroid hormone also rises. So the issue with hormonal systems is that they come in cycles, they're slower to come on. I like to call the hormonal system the grandma that you have to coax. You cannot say do this. You have to force it to come online. You have to coax it rather to come online. So so you have to make sure that you balance all of the major hormones. It's people say, well, it's expensive. Well, how much are you worth? Would you like to treat yourself as a Lamborghini or as a some other cheap car? So so that's I teach my clients also how to do this for themselves, because majority of them do a lot of this kind of jet setting to manipulate the hormones according to the time zones that they're in. But I never give them in single doses. As you know, I like networks. I like seeing things in terms of networks. So your entire network of major hormones are actually optimized at the proper times, and you're able to perform right away as soon as you land.
And so can we go into some of these things that these people, or maybe some just sharing your own personal example, what are some of the you mentioned optimizing hormones. Are you taking the hormones themselves directly? You said sunlight as well. What are some of the other tools in the toolkit of Dr. Ted?
Um, well, it's simple. For me, it's like grounding because
Mm-hmm.
you're out in touch with the earth. You go bare feet, or all bathtubs are grounded. You could take a nice warm bath too. Uh, it is basically addressing your light, water, and magnetisms. And then you expose yourself to the light cycles of the place that you're in. Your tendency is actually to, you want to go sleep, you're so tired and so on, but you got to force yourself out there in the sun so that your body adapts a lot faster. Now, in terms of hormones, it's I usually when I wake up in the morning, I have my thyroid hormone, and then the one that regulates the clock actually quite well is the cortisol, or you can give hydrocortisone, and it's given in 4 doses, like at 8 a.m., 12 noon, 5 p.m., and 9 p.m. And that simulates, with a proper dose, that simulates actually the rise and fall of cortisol during the day. And then growth hormone, I actually give it at night. You know, uh, uh, just to aid in the growth hormone naturally accompanies the first hour of sleep. But within the first 3 days, I usually mimic the male hormone by injecting the hormone itself, which comes in for me 4 injections for at least 3 days. But to your other questions, I do rotate. The nightly dose of growth hormone is rotated. I use several secretagogues,
Mm-hmm.
the growth hormone releasing hormone peptides that are available currently. So because when you're using this long term, you actually don't want any negative feedback, even if you're using very low doses, right? The
Mm-hmm.
fear of this is that you use it at a very high dose, like bodybuilders do. No, you don't. You actually use very, very small. You use very less than you in most cases. And in fact, when endocrinologists learn how small the doses are, they're actually shocked. It's like those things actually work, but we're not treating disease. We're help the body reoptimize back to its levels when it's in another time zone. So if releasing hormones are available, then I take breaks and take releasing hormone instead as a substitute. And then you have to aid your pancreas for those. I don't take insulin. I just lipoic acid with every meal
Mm-hmm.
that I take, and then so essentially you're taking a look at the major endocrine. So you take a look at your pineal. So I take melatonin at night.
Mm-hmm.
And then you take a look at the pituitary. I take growth hormone at night. Then I took a thyroid, which is I take as soon as I wake up in the morning. And then I take care of my pancreas by taking lipoic acid with each meal. And then I take care of my adrenals. So essentially what I do is go from the top down of the major endocrine nexuses, right? So from the top, you have the pituitary, the pineal gland, where I take melatonin. The pituitary, I take growth hormone. The thyroid, I take thyroid hormones. For the thymus, I actually take a couple of thymus glandular capsules, and it aids my immune system quite a bit. And then for my pancreas, I don't take insulin. I take alpha lipoic acid with each meal. For my adrenals, I take hydrocortisone in the proper dose at the proper timing of the day. And then for my gonads, I take testosterone. I inject it subcutaneously twice a week at a very low dose.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my program. That's my personal program.
So that is extremely comprehensive. And there's probably somebody listening here right now that says, how could you possibly do that without a doctor? Any response to that?
I am a doctor, and my patients are not doctors.
Yeah.
They run companies, they run countries, they run important things according to what we deem is important. But I teach them how to inject. I teach them how to adjust the doses. For example, there was this woman who basically owned a very huge restaurant and catering business, and which was countrywide. And she used to be get very angry and agitated during meetings. And I told her how to modulate or the use of hydrocortisone, before the meeting, so she would actually calm down and deal with the stress a little bit better rather than screaming during meetings. So they learn over time, because what my goal, Boomer, is that when you come to me as a client, I want to get you addicted to the feeling of wellness, right? Mm-hmm. So that when you get off kilter, you know that you really are off kilter, right? And you want to go back to balance right away. And what most people realize is that this is not an overnight process. The effects, for example, the effects of hormones will occur in about 3 months, because the red blood cells, or the blood cells in general, they replenish themselves every 90 to 120 days. So that's the effect that's more quick that comes. But for nutrient balancing, for example, when you balance the nutrients, your nutrients are like your levels of CoQ10, your alpha lipoic acid, your B vitamins, and so on, that may come only after 6 to 9 months. Mm-hmm. So you have to be patient in doing this. And therefore, when you do this, you actually have to take a look at the lifestyle, or your lifestyle, if you're going to apply this to yourself. For example, I have CEOs who say, Dr. Ted, I cannot take 3 packets of supplements a day. Can you front load this? So we'll see what can be front loaded in the morning. However, it does take a little bit of selfishness for wellness. You got to take care of yourself first. Most moms and dads tell me all the time, I have my kids to take care of, and I have this to take care of and that. Well, if you get sick, who's going to take care of them? So you got to give some time for you to take care of you first before you take care of someone else. And this is automatic. That the biggest problem with this kind of balancing of your hormones and nutrients and metabolites inside the body is compliance. So you make it easy for the client to actually comply. And the only skill that's actually needed are for the injectables, and it's easy to teach. As one client of mine said, she said, Dr. Ted, that's just a subcutaneous injection. That's not surgery. So you could see the differences in perspective of people. Whereas, some people you have, it takes months for them to overcome the fear of the needle. But what? Especially in men, once they get the benefit of it, including the testosterone injection, they are asking for when their next injection is going to be. And you say, okay, here it is. You have to learn how to do it yourself, right? So essentially all of them learn how to do this. And when they travel, they come with a full set. I issue them a PDF prescription. So they could actually show it.
So you can cross borders?
Yeah. So you can cross borders with them.
That's excellent. I want to come back to some of these hormones in a little bit. But Dr. Ted, you have a crazy background.
Yes,
background, bio. You finished college at 18, medical school at 22. You've done a lot. And one of the questions that comes to mind when you see a bio like yours is, with what you've been able to accomplish, you must have a strong underlying purpose. Do you mind sharing what that purpose or that drive really is for you to be able to accomplish all these things?
My drive, Boomer, comes from curiosity. Um, I am curious about the world that I live in. You know, I am curious about what things are, what they work, how we think about them, what other people think about them, what people who oppose the current point of view think about it. And that drives me. Like, for example, when I was, of course, an oddball being in first year college at 15 years old. But for me, for example, in biology, that's why I studied, and my undergrad was in biology. It's because I was curious about life in general.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious, like, other than a philosophical definition of life, what is a biological definition of life, and then now, what is a definition of life in physics, as we see it. So, and then that translated to, going to medical school, and then studying pharmacology and toxicology, right? Because in medicine, we give drugs all the time. So I said, why aren't people more curious about drugs? Why aren't doctors more curious about drugs, about what they are, what they do, how the body deals with them? And this is where, things before, when I was beginning practice, it's actually quite interesting because the doctors would call me and would say, Dr. Ted, how is your vitamin mineral hormone balancing going to affect my drug treatment? And I said, you have this all wrong. It's the other way around. My vitamins, minerals, hormones have been seen by the patient's body in evolution, right? It sees all of these nutrients in food. However, your drugs are actually a stranger to the body. So you have to tell me how your drugs are going to affect my balancing of the hormones and nutrients in the body, right? So this kind of curiosity will actually allow you to give answers like that, which are perspective changing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, I actually trained in interventional neuroradiology because I was very much interested in the brain. And initially, I was very brain centric. Because that's what people who are in the top of their class are supposed to do. But I quickly realized that the body is an integrated system. It cannot be one or the other. Everything. There's a saying here in the Philippines. That the pain of the pinky is the pain of the whole body, and things like those should give you pause. Over the importance of one thing over the other. And then while in biology, what drove me to think actually more closely was when I took evolutionary biology and ecology were part of a network. What has disappeared, Boomer, in our living and thinking conditions today is that we are part of the environment. We shape the environment, and the environment shapes us. And we think we have control of the environment, but no, we don't. There are so many things about the environment that that we don't know about, right? And how it shapes us. And all of this study now about, for example, the microbiota of the skin, the microbiota of your nose, and even of your cornea, and so on. We're only seeing now the effects of this, that we are actually being influenced by the environment more than we think we do. Why do you think we have phototoxicity? Because of the artificial light that we have created. So we created the science of chronobiology, to see how we respond to light cycles and so on. So there's this, if you maintain this kind of curiosity, then you will go on and on. You jump from one thing to the other. And at George Washington University, my research area was in artificial intelligence, and that's where I got into connectionist systems, was the way we called it back then. And I realized that they were calling it deep learning today, but it's all in the marketing.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Somebody had a different way to trademark something. I'm guessing.
Yeah. So I wrote a book on the neural connections of a worm that they are using now extensively, actually, for a lot of anti-aging studies, and it's a workhorse, in fact, for longevity and anti-aging studies. But I would just to say this as an aside, it's like I'm not a longevity doctor, right? I'm a quality of life doctor.
Mm-hmm.
It's C. elegans, and I basically did the first mapping of all the connections in its nervous system, right?
Wow.
And then I did mathematical calculations on it. The way to think about it is, remember there used to be a game called 6 Degrees to Kevin Bacon?
Yes.
So
fun
my my assertion there is that in the brain, it's only 3 degrees, right? So what in 3 neurons or less, a neuron knows what another neuron is doing. So the way to think about it is, I was looking at what's called cellular automata, and so the way to visualize cellular automata is these are like ants, right? Ants in an anthill. When you take a look at the ant itself, it's just performing something that you think is quite robotic, but it's actually quite alive, right? You think it has its own volitional behavior and so on. But when you see the colony that it creates and the complexity of all of that, which is a work of all of the ants together, so becomes 1 + 1 = 3. And so I became intrigued by, is consciousness in human beings like an emergent property of complex systems? Or is it something that's actually wired? So what I did with the worm was I took out all the circuits from it. The circuit that says, now I feed, now I mate, now I crawl, And so I said, and I was looking for, is there a main circuit that says, now I'm going to do all these things? And it turns out that there's none. And we could see now that these things are happening in the internet, right? The internet will have all its natural oscillations now. Some of them are bad, some of them are good, but you see it actually having all of these emergent properties because it's become so complex. One of the things that I've railed on very, very on, even before the development of the internet was commercialized. When I was using the internet before, you would pose a question, hey, I'm doing a Navier-Stokes equation, and they would, 6 Nobel laureates would actually answer you, right? Gone are those days. You can't do that anymore.
Yeah, you post that on Quora now. You're going to get a bunch of college students trying to interpret that.
Yeah, and what I said before in a lecture that I made was that the internet is currently full of irrelevant information, right? It's noise, and the signal to noise ratio is actually quite low now. So. Whereas the way I phrased it before is that if I farted in California, no one ever needed to know about it in Washington, D.C., right? Unless I was a gastric case where they would need to know whether or not I have developed flatulence. So, so this was a result of my research in artificial intelligence, was doing a lot of these connectionist systems. And as you see now, it's actually reflected in my practice. Much of the errors that we have made, for example, in anti-aging medicine, is precisely we have given estrogen singly, and suddenly you have cancers. You have given testosterone singly, and then you have cancers. These are all acting within a network, and you cannot separate it from them. So if you extend that further, one of the new concepts that I have introduced, in fact, and which I will be talking about in my presentation in London that's coming up, is that, when you're looking at how we do things right now, even in illness medicine, with all of the specialties, they're looking at essentially individuals in population, right? So the diseases are actually looked at like, okay, what's my 5-year mortality rate and so on. So that's how you do it. But for me, what I want physicians and other healthcare practitioners to look at, actually, and yourself too, is to shift and take a look at the entire body as an ecosystem of organisms, right? We're an ecosystem of organisms, and all of those organisms at that level are cooperating, antagonizing, and doing all sorts of things to each other, right? So it's only recently, for example, that we have established that mitochondria, which are the bacteria inside your cells that produce your energy, and microbiota, majority 78% of which is in your gut, and the rest is in elsewhere in your body. They talk. They have a crosstalk via various signaling molecules. So the bacteria in your body are actually talking to each other, and this is actually beyond your consciousness. They've been talking forever. It's just that we're just realizing it now. A friend of mine who founded the World Mitochondria Society out of Paris actually said, Ted, I believe we're just renters in this body. The consciousness is renting from the bacteria. So that kind of a point of view now has enabled us, to see us not as an individual organism, but rather we are an ecosystem of organisms, and that allows us to provide better healthcare for ourselves. Right? Look what the big thing right now is microbiota, right? All of these probiotics and so on and so forth, and we're going towards targeted probiotics where they take a look at your population sample of your poop. If you lack certain organisms in there, in the near future, they will be able to provide it for you. Right? So these are the kinds of things that a point of view such as that, which my colleague and mentee Scott Scher in another episode of yours mentioned, is that it's the Holobiont.
I was just going to add, because this sounds very, very similar to that concept of Holobiont.
Well, I taught him that word. that word exists, and it's different. People say, "Well, no, we're superorganisms." No, Boomer. A superorganism is an organism that's made up of just one species of organism, right? But a holobiont is made up of different species of organisms. Now, just a brief history to your listeners is that actually our main cell, if you take a look at it, is actually composed of two cells, right? The one cell, in a very long time ago, was a cell that could produce energy without oxygen. And then it went into a relationship or symbiotic relationship with the mitochondria, which is another bacterium, right? And the bacterium is actually able to use oxygen to produce energy, and they produce a lot more. For those in finance, you might think that, oh my God, there's such a harmonious relationship. No, actually it wasn't. The anaerobic bacterium, or the one who couldn't produce energy without oxygen, wanted to steal the genes of the mitochondria. That was the initial setup. That was the initial intent. But due to rising oxygen conditions in the atmosphere, they went into a symbiotic relationship. So that's how the environment actually shaped their relationship, right? It's kind of like, if you're married and you're living with your in-laws, that will shape your relationship a different way than you're living away from them.
Oh, that would be problematic.
So this is how we're so unaware of how our bodies are evolved this way, right? They evolved this way. So all of this, these different bacteria that comprise us are still maintain their bacterial quality to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not our fault, because in terms of understanding it, I think before we did not have the technology to do it, right? To understand this. Before, what is a cell anyway? We were introduced to it as a soup, and it had all of these chemicals in it, and they bumped into each other, and
it turns out it's not flat.
and it turns, and not only that, it turns out that it's a highly ordered and architectured factory. Because now that we can take a look at it that way, we could see how orderly the cell is, how it has to keep producing energy in order to maintain its structure, so the microtubules can maintain its can maintain the cytoskeleton of the cell, and so on and so forth. And this is another thing about us and environment, right? Most of the chemical reactions are occurring in the cytoplasm of the cell, right? And this is the foreground, background thing that, we human beings tend to pay attention to the foreground. Like, we pay attention to the letters, the words in a book, right? But we don't pay attention to the space of the printed page, right? But if you take a look at the poems of E.E. Cummings, for example, and how he positions the words in the page, and suddenly you realize that the background is as important as the foreground, correct?
Yeah.
I presented a paper many years ago, probably a couple of decades ago, in Guadalajara, and it was on how long is the present moment? Like, how many seconds is the present moment?
This could go. So, Dr. Ted, this is fascinating, because I also want to go back to some of the things you said on consciousness, but I would love to. Yeah. Let's hear about the paper first.
Yeah. No, that. But how long is the present moment? But that's exactly what I was talking about. Is that I proposed there, and this is relevant to what we're discussing, is that we are focusing on the brain signals, right? Mm-hmm. The firing of the neurons. Everyone's talking about the synaptic firing, but no one's paying attention to the silence between the signals, right? And I said, maybe there's some meaning to the silence between the signals. How come no one is paying attention to those? So I started paying attention to that, and that became germane to a lot of the mathematics that I proposed in my book. So, it's a very simple principle, that you could tease out. And in terms of, like, for example, a fractal rule, right, is something very simple. Mm-hmm. If you are able to decode what those very simple rules are that repeat over and over, then you're likely to identify the larger pattern. Although it will surprise you, because a larger pattern is complex, you will actually see that the elements are actually quite simple.
Okay. So there's a few things that I want to talk about here, because this fractal pattern and coming out of this, can we back up just a little bit to consciousness in general, and some of the work that you've done around the mathematical approach mathematical approach to consciousness. Some of the listenership, and I come from this background as well, and sort of the hyper rational, we have this misconception of consciousness. Do you mind just walking us through sort of what is consciousness, and why, this mathematical, how did you come to find really that mathematical approach? Like, what were the patterns other than the fractal rule that you were starting to observe? Let's talk about elevating the human experience. If you're on a path to having an elevated human experience, at some point you're going to tackle the topic of cognitive enhancement. The product that I am most excited to see come online this year when it comes to cognitive enhancement, and Dr. Ted is not paying me to say this, is Blue Cannatine. I had a chance to try Blue Cannatine at Munich's FlowFest earlier this year, and it did not disappoint. My mind was clear. I was calm. My recall was great. And best of all, actually not best of all, it's just a fun experience. My mouth was blue. I went full on Smurf mode. If you want to try out Blue Cannatine, head over to Troscriptions.com. That's Troscriptions.com, and enjoy the rest of my conversation with Dr. Ted Achacoso.
So I define consciousness in a very practical sense, right? It's that which disappears. I define it by what it is not, right? It's that which disappears when you sleep or when you're under anesthesia, right? So that's my practical definition of consciousness. That's very different from awareness, and there's difference from focused awareness and so on. The Nobel laureate Edelman actually described consciousness in two parts. He said one is the primary consciousness, which is the consciousness of the dogs who do not do, or your cats that do not do any symbolic processing, right? Or if they do it very minimally. And so, you've heard the saying, cats are your best Zen teachers or whatever. That's primary consciousness. And then the secondary consciousness is that which is narrated by your ego, the story that you keep. My name is Dr. Ted. I like this. I don't like this. My boundaries are these, etc., etc. And that story is alive while you're awake, right? So that's the other consciousness that's there. But for me, that symbolic consciousness that's there, that's all semantics, right? That's all semantics. That's all like the meaning of your life and, what purpose I have and so on. That's all meaning, right? I was focusing on the syntax. What's producing this, right? How do these circuits form? Why do they reverberate that way? How do they wire together such that they form these kinds of circuits? So I was looking at, well, what are the influences of evolution, influences of development during pregnancy, and influences of your environment, such that these things are wired. We already know, for example, that children that are given a hyperstimulative environment develop a larger number of connections in the brain, and therefore end up to have a much higher IQ rather than those who are given a more sparse environments. And just as an aside, guys, this actually translates to addiction. And the study, for example, in rats and nicotine, for example, and not actually nicotine, rats and cocaine rather, is that if you place a rat with cocaine and in just a bare cage, it will tend between the unspiked and spiked water, they will hit the spiked water all the time. But when you place them in a stimuli-rich environment where they are in the company of other rats, right? In the company of other rats where they can play with, etc., they noticed that the cocaine spiked water was rarely touched, because they had other things to focus on in their environment. So you could see here that for me, Boomer, that's how you observe things, right? You take a look at what's going on externally. Could that map in internally, right? But always being cognizant of the fact that the map is not the terrain, right? So you're just forming maps of, if this is a behavior, can I map it to the firing of certain neurons that do this? We now know that there are facial neurons, if you hit them, certain faces appear. But at the same time, there are also circuits, circuits that go from one place to the other. And some of them are stronger than others, much like, there is an Amazon, a Google, a Microsoft, and so on. There are certain centers of these types of computation in your brain that do that. So how are those things wired? And how do they produce you, right? So for the primary awareness, there's no symbolic processing that's going on. So that's dependent on your reticular activating system, whether or not you wake up, and so on. For example, if you are in a locked-in syndrome, this is the very scary syndrome where you are very aware and very awake, and you cannot move a single muscle, right? It's one of the worst things that could happen to you. It just shows you that a person can be fully conscious on the secondary level, but and by definition, because he's breathing and everything else is functioning, except that he's fully encaged rather than in his own body, shows you that there's a part of the wiring of the primary consciousness that is actually essential to the rest of the body. So for the secondary functions to come up, or for the secondary consciousness. So and so when you're thinking of this, if the practical application of this, Boomer, is meditation, right?
Yeah.
When you're meditating, you're actually shifting yourself to primary consciousness. Why do they want you to swat the thoughts away, or just accept them, or make them disappear like a cloud, or whatever? And the reason for that is that symbolic processing, right? That's done. And so you want to go back to the primary consciousness, which has no thought in it, and therefore no meaning. Of course, the other danger, quote unquote, of thought is that it fishes for your emotion. Like you remember your quarrel with your boss, and suddenly these thoughts come in, and suddenly the emotion comes in, right? And I could relate this very quickly now to, for example, the new forms of therapy for example, PTSD would be like MDMA, right?
Yeah.
Or ecstasy. So that would separate, for example, the meaning from the actual semantics of the situation, right? That's a pure informational content versus the meaning of the content. So you could see how it quote unquote fractalizes from those primary structures or connections into trees that begin to have semantic overtones until they have a full semantic tree on top of it. And that's the same way with health optimization medicine, right? One of the things that I say to coaches and all these other people who are helping coach performance, you cannot improve performance, you cannot optimize performance without optimizing your health first. In any situation, whether or not you're a CEO, whether or not you're a elite player or athlete or so on, you have to optimize your health first before you can optimize the performance. The shorthand of that, Boomer, is that you have to master plain vanilla sex before you can become a porn star.
Damn.
Right? So
that's there's no shortcuts, it sounds like. So Dr. Achacoso, I wanted to interrupt you because you're going and you provided the perfect segue into this, so thank you. Health optimization medicine, you mentioned it a couple of times, and I do want to touch a little bit on that foundation that you just mentioned. But what is health optimization medicine?
Well, it's like this, okay? In a simple definition, health optimization medicine is the detection and correction of the imbalances of the metabolites in the body. That's a very simple definition. But it's like this. It comes from actually what illness medicine doctors do. They diagnose and treat disease, right? And in illness medicine, we only have one mantra, right? Our mantra is you have to diagnose the disease, that's pathology, right? And then you give drugs, that's pharmacology, or you do surgery, which is surgery. So, and so you have for each area of study, like cardiology for the heart and neurology for the brain and central nervous system and so on, you see that it's anatomy, physiology, pathology, and then pharmacology, surgery. Over and over, it's the same thing at each specialty, right? So it's like you get a flat tire in a car, and you can either change the entire tire and you have a heart transplant surgery, right? Or you can patch it and you have a coronary bypass graft. Or your engine is overheated and you get antibiotics because you have an infection, and your fever goes down, and so on. So we are actually taught how to diagnose and repair, right? But no one actually taught us how to maintain the body. I like to say that the cars are luckier these days because every 3,000 miles is a warning, right? Our bodies don't have that warning. It's what they said. However, the technology has now developed such that we can now take a look at what's going on before disease sets in. And that's why I chose the field of clinical metabolomics, because it's 40 years old. It's now only coming to the clinics. It doesn't have to be the base, but right now it's what we can use effectively as a practical means in order to maintain health and prevent disease, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the other part. So aside from, health optimization medicine then is the clinical practice for maintaining health and preventing disease. So it's the missing part of medical education, right? Mm-hmm. So medical education, you have diseases all over the place. So in health optimization, we focus on health. So I always say this is that health is really three elements: A plus B plus C, right? A is the absence of disease, which is illness medicine, right? Mm-hmm. Right? And B is the balance between the anabolic, meaning the processes that build, and catabolic, the processes that destroy, according to C, the life cycle of the organism. So health equals A plus B plus C. And health optimization medicine actually does B plus C, right? Which mm-hmm. is the balance between the anabolic and catabolic processes. Now, at what level do we do that is the important question. Whereas, for example, in illness medicine, you do it by the organ, right? Here we do it in the level of the cell. Mm-hmm. So you do it at the level of the holobiont, in fact. Not just the level of the cell, but the level of the holobiont, the cell and its interactions with all the other cells surrounding it. Mm-hmm. So, and that before, we used to just memorize, for example, the metabolites of the Krebs cycle, right? That produces your ATP. Now you could actually measure them, and you could measure what the cofactors or the vitamins that are needed to actually make the cycle go a little bit more optimal to produce more energy for you. Right? These are the B vitamins mm-hmm. That you need, right? That's why the B vitamins are called the energy vitamins, because they impact that cycle. But because of the march of technology, we can now detect, what those levels are and how much of these vitamins that you will be needing, or how much additional cofactors you will be needing. Mm-hmm. It may be that in the future, it may not be metabolomics that will be the level by which you diagnose. It may be, at the quantum level, you may have quantum diagnostics, but we're not yet there.
That would be really exciting. And when we get there, I want you back on the show, because this is... just to point people to the episode with Scott on the metabolomics side, we go a little bit into why health optimization medicine does use metabolomics there. Now, one of the things that you brought up, Dr. Ted, and this is a question that people have come to ask, in terms of testing B vitamins and measuring the Krebs cycle, I know you guys mentioned the use of Scott mentioned the use of the NutriEval, and yes. Looking at B vitamin levels, there's some controversy whether or not B12 can be measured through a test. What is your response to that?
Okay, as anyone who's interested in evolution is, mm-hmm. I will give an evolutionary point of view, more like a cognitive bias point of view. Okay, right? It's like this. There's a cognitive bias called chauffeur information. Mm-hmm. A lot of people, you know that cognitive bias, right?
Oh, yes.
Where Max Planck and his chauffeur.
It's such a great story, but if you're willing to just share it for people who are listening.
So anyway, Max Planck was lecturing all over Germany with his chauffeur on the the quantum physics that he was espousing at the time. So they've delivered the lectures to so many universities already, and the chauffeur was always present, such that he has already memorized all the lectures, all the questions, all the answers, and so on. So when he was going to lecture in Munich, the driver said, "Hey, let's play a game. Why don't I dress up as you and you as me, since they don't know who you are, and I'll deliver the lecture." And so the chauffeur delivered the lecture to aplomb, with the standing ovation and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question and answer came, and he was able to answer the questions brilliantly because he's memorized all the answers. And then a very difficult question came, and he said, "Oh my God!" He said, "That's such an easy question." He said, "Even my chauffeur can answer it." So, so there are many purveyors of chauffeur information out there. What you need to do is, why don't you try it yourself in the clinics?
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is the same is true with the allergics, with the food sensitivity tests, and so on and so forth. It's the best that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question that I have is, have you used it? Have you had good results with it?
Mm-hmm.
If medicine is eclectic and pragmatic, healthcare is eclectic and pragmatic. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But from what I found in the 10 years that I've been using it, it works. So for me, to get the results that I'm getting for my clients is good enough for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can do a lot of intellectual masturbation on how the process is and so on and so forth. But in the end, there is a patient or a client in front of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do to this? You're not going to argue in your head, should I give this test? Should I give this test? You give what's available for testing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you do your assessment, right? And then you do your assessment. And you exercise you exercise your, it doesn't mean exercise some prudence in the matter, but it doesn't mean that you don't do your studying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because technologies actually evolve over time. I was lucky enough with mentors, actually, Boomer.
Mm-hmm.
I was mentored by the guy who started medical informatics all over the world. I was an assistant professor of medical informatics at George Washington University.
Wow.
For quite a while. And in that same building where I worked, in my the floor above me was the lab of a certain Dr. Pitberger. He started the whole vector, the reading of vector electrocardiography, or the EKGs that you're getting now.
Yeah.
He started automating the reading of that. So, and then now we sort of like, what kind of machines are these that don't read automatically, right? But the beginnings of those are during this time. So it's the same thing with this. We're learning, we're accumulating all of this, and these things work. We know that these things work. We know that these things don't, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that health is a very individual thing,
Yep.
right? It's a very individual thing. It's not a one size fits all thing. And like in disease, all of your antibiotics should work across the population, right? Your intervention should work across the population. And the thing that I lament about really is that, for example, the mental health guidelines, the diabetes guidelines, the cardiology guidelines in illness medicine are so long, and they just, it's just impossible for a person to look at them. It's because their guideline is actually looking at mortality rates. But when you're looking at it as a person in terms of health, you have to adjust everything and take a look at it from that individual point of view, the ecosystem that's in the individual, right? And that's why when you're looking at, for example, all the tests that you're using in here is like, am I making an impact on the patient? For example, even if it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, can I use it for monitoring?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Can I monitor it? So it doesn't mean that because a test isn't perfect, it doesn't mean that it couldn't be used, right? Otherwise, most of the laboratory tests that we're using today wouldn't have been developed.
And same thing with wearable technology, right?
Yes. In terms of those gadgets, like for example, I wear the Aura ring, right,
Mm-hmm.
And so on. It's like they had to adjust their not only the size of their ring, but they had to adjust their algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was getting like unusual amounts of sleep, and I have an EEG at my house. It's one of my toys that I use.
Sounds like I should come over and play it, Dr. Kerr.
These are the things that you correlate with, but you're patient because, they're trying to do the best they can, with doing nanotechnology and doing all of this miniaturizing a lot of things. you know, uh, speaking of miniaturization, just an aside, I consulted for an investment fund before, and they asked me about Theranos, the failed $9 billion
Yeah.
company.
Yeah.
I actually refused. I said, microfluidics is not at that level. I was given grief by that fund for 2 years until the whole thing started unraveling. And they said, Dr. Ted, thank you very much for not letting us invest in that
Yeah.
company.
Yeah.
But anyway, there are things like those. So you have to be prudent as regards what you use and what you don't use. But if something has already been done for, say, a decade or more, you at least have confidence that they already have ironed out a lot of things. What is more important is establishing now what are the ranges that are optimal to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why for me in health optimization medicine, I settled on the age 21 to 30, which is supposed to be the range where all of your hormones, nutrients, etc., are optimal. And your body's reproducing, and you're supposed to be at the top of your game. In fact, the way I joke people is that, for example, if there is a 27-year-old that shows me his rip abs and so on and so forth, I said, you should be looking that way. Try looking like me when you're 58. So, it's just like it's become a norm for us to say, oh, this you have all this body weight, and then suddenly at 27 you get ripped and so on, and it's a miracle. No, fuck that. You're supposed to look that way. Mm-hmm. That's supposed to be your natural self, right? Mm-hmm. And it just shows you how the environment has actually reshaped you into how you are. Your work environment, the stuff that you eat, and so on, and how we have tinkered with all of the sources of food, the sources of light, sources of electromagnetism. They all affect you, and there you are, highly inflamed, obese. And what you can do is, in a practical way, how do you mitigate that? Mm-hmm. So, for example, let me give an example for testing, right? Right now, we can actually measure cytokines for inflammation, right? And the major cytokine for inflammation, of course, is NF-kappa B, right? Mm-hmm. However, that's very expensive, and not all hospitals will do it, right? So you get a simple test like HSCRP or high sensitivity CRP, which can be requested. It's very inexpensive, right? So instead of getting the regular CRP, get the high sensitivity CRP, and you could already have a gauge of your body's inflammation. Mm-hmm. So that when you've been partying too much and you lack sleep, etc., you're expecting that HSCRP to go back up. So when you're actually sleeping well and eating well and so on, you could see that your body inflammation goes down. Very simple, mm-hmm. right? Of course, I like to use the oxidative stress panel, of the metabolomics lab, mm-hmm. Because it shows you your glutathione levels, your CoQ10 levels, your capacity of the body to detoxify, your how fast your membranes are rusting, because oxidation is basically rusting of your cell membranes, right? Mm-hmm. It shows you how fast your DNA is rusting and making you predisposed to cancer. Right. So overall, it shows you how fast you're aging. When I was training in Paris, the T-bar test, or the how fast your cell membranes were rusting, was the only test that we had. Right. Mm-hmm. But now we have all of these tests that help us. So I have a very healthy attitude towards these new tests. See, before you open your mouth, A, make sure that you're practicing, or B, you're the researcher who actually created the product.
Yeah.
And, and then see if it works. If it doesn't, then don't use it. If you try it in 10 of your clients or patients and it works for 9 of them, then it's you judge that. As a clinician, you're able to do that. You can correlate it with other tests, right?
Absolutely. And there's a phrase out there in a functional medicine world, and this actually sparks another question that I would love to ask you. Okay, throw your hands up if your mind's about ready to explode. Dr. Ted is amazing. He's knowledgeable about so many facets of life, and we're only scratching the surface with him. This is just the first half, and I loved covering topics like dynamic systems as well as mathematics of consciousness. Next week, we're going to get in so much more, things like psychedelics. We're going to talk about health optimization medicine, and we are going to get into troches and Blue Cannatine. Again, the show notes for this one are at decodingsuperhuman.com/home, as in health optimization medicine. That's HOME. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with everybody you know. Throw it out on all your socials, but also head over to iTunes and leave us a rating. Leave us a 5-star rating if you don't mind, and a comment along with it. Love to hear from you guys. Superhumans, have an absolutely epic